Thank you, Diana. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for organizing this event. It's really a pleasure being here. We already started having some very interesting discussions, and I'm sure they're going to continue throughout the day. So I'm going to be quick with my presentation to leave time for questions and answers and engage around some of the messages and data presented in this work. So this report we produced in collaboration with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and the African Development Bank, based on the recognition that there is a need to provide data and evidence on the economic contribution of African cities and urbanization to national development. So what we did, we looked at data from more than 4 million individuals and firms in 2,600 cities across 34 countries. The data we could use had to be geo-referenced, so we could match it to cities and urban agglomerations that we took out of the Africa POLIS database. A couple of more words to the data is the data is supposed to cover also the informal sector, so it is city-wide and it is in most cases representative. Although there are very wide national and regional differences, the trends presented in the figures, they are consistent across all countries. And in the report, you're going to have more figures and more data also on some individual cities. As for the Africa POLIS database on urbanization in cities, it applies a homogeneous definition to what is urban. So this then also allows to compare this performance across countries, which is important for people who know that every country defines what is a city and urban area according to their own priorities, agendas, and specificities. As to the interpretation, what you're going to see also through the figures and maps you're going to show is that large cities perform better than small cities, and small cities perform much better than rural areas. So this is something that we see across the world as well. But what we found interesting, particularly interesting, is the difference in performance between rural areas and small urban agglomerations. And something to the context, and this is what you see on the map that is on the slide, is please keep in mind that over the past 30 years, Africa's cities grew by more than 500 million people. So they tripled in size over the last 30 years. And this is important to keep in mind when looking at the performance of Africa's cities. So let me start going into the key messages. So across all the socioeconomic dimensions that we measured, cities outperform rural areas by a wide margin. And this difference in outperformance in Africa is larger than in other regions of the world, for us indicating there's a particular premium to Africa's cities and urbanization in the development context. Also, we estimated that over the past 20 years, Africa's GDP per capita growth was 30% due to urbanization, just to the growth of cities and urbanization across the countries. And also what we show is that rural areas also do benefit from urbanization. And this is, we see across certain indicators that rural areas close to cities perform better than more remote rural areas. So urbanization has a real developmental impact in Africa. As to some of the graphs and figures that we looked at, the first one is on the share of skilled jobs. We see that the share of skilled jobs are 2.5 times higher in cities on average than in rural areas. We also see that urban residents are 3 times more likely to be in wage employment, and wages are up to 100% higher in urban areas. So wage employment is indeed very important because it has been shown that this is one of the key drivers to poverty reduction across the globe. A more business side where we had much less data, and here's only a comparison between larger and smaller cities, we see that firms in larger cities are 2 times more likely to invest in research and development, which then also has implications on the productivity and their export potential. Something that summarizes the socioeconomic performance across cities is the distribution of wealth quintiles. And here again, we see that that 59% of the population in large cities are in the top wealth quintile, with 30% in small cities and only 4% in rural areas. So all these wage employment, skilled jobs, all these have effects also on the wealth distribution, and this is what is shown on this slide. And again, the difference between rural areas and urban areas are pretty stark. Something more on the long-term development impact of cities. So on education, urban residents receive on average 2.5 to 4 more years of education than rural residents. And very interesting here is, although women on average receive less education, but women in small urban agglomerations already have more education than rural men. So there is also benefits in terms of gender equality going into more urban areas. And they do have long-term economic impacts, and they also have impacts beyond economic dimensions. So we know that higher educational outcomes are associated with better health, better nutritional status across countries. Then we also see that the access to services like electricity or access to water and mobile phone ownership, this is maybe not so surprising, is higher in urban areas than in rural areas. And again, here, this is notably also a case where the variations across countries and cities are very large. But it shows that this trend holds across all the countries we looked at. This is on dependency ratio. So this is the share of the active to the non-active population, economically active population, let me specify. And again, we have here a nice downward slope and difference between rural and urban areas. And this is also often associated with what is called a demographic dividend. So more resources to invest in economic activities and education, for instance, and health. And this is a slide on access to bank accounts. I can't see which is, yeah, this is the bank account, the share of households that do have a bank account compared again across the spectrum between rural and large cities. And we also have a similar trend when we look at holding the title to a house. We see this as something important also in going forward, because this is often associated with better access to financial services and being able to access more productive activities, kind of also leading to connecting to more formal activities and developing activities, business activities. So let me now go to the link to rural areas. We have now 50% of rural households live at less than 14 kilometers from a city, the closest city. And for 2/3, the closest city is a small city. So again, the link to the importance of integrating the urban network, looking also at small urban agglomerations, not just the big cities. What I said before is like the performance linked to proximity to a city. Here we have the share of skilled jobs mapped to the distance, and we can see the closer you are to a city, the more access, the more skilled jobs you have. And then there are also other dimensions like the average years of schooling, distribution top in terms of wealth quintile, or the bank account. And again, this also holds across all countries. So we see something that is often ignored in the urban debate is that, or is missed, is that with urbanization, you increase rural-urban linkages. You have seen on the first map, like the urbanization in Africa is not only linked to bigger cities, but also more cities. So the number of cities in Africa over the past 30 years more than doubled, from 4,400 to almost 8,000 now. So that means average distance between cities is shrinking, but also distance between rural and urban environments creating this increasing interaction between these two environments. And this is something there's a need to invest in and see how we can leverage these opportunities and better use them for national development. Something else we looked at is the emergence of city clusters. Around the world, many of the most successful cities are part of a larger cluster of cities. And this is because clusters provide an economic ecosystem in terms of customers, suppliers, investors, infrastructure that is much larger than that of an individual city. So we also see that, we mapped that currently there are 32 clusters, 60% of Africa's urban population. Interesting again is the geographic distribution. 50% of these clusters are inland, not just the coastal cities are concerned. But since these clusters are very young, because they're still growing, they lack quite a lot of the physical and administrative connective infrastructure to fully benefit from being in close proximity. So we think investing in these clusters is going to be important going forward, especially in the context of the African continental free trade area, and to see how cities can play a particular role in continental integration. And again, also looking at inter-African integration, not just around the ports, but also through the interior. Something also important to mention is that although we see this performance trend between rural and urban environments, we see no improvement or very little improvement over time in cities and in socioeconomic performance. And this is again to the context I mentioned before. It's like 500 more million people to absorb it's a big achievement. Having a constant performance means that these 500 million people actually were integrated while maintaining their performance. And all this happened in a context where many African cities are not well planned, lack infrastructure and resources, and the services are not at a level that is seen in other areas. So there is a need to increase the planning for cities. There's a need to invest and to develop the right policy frameworks to really also see an improvement over time in cities. But again, from our point of view, the achievement of maintaining this performance while having this incredible growth is already a testament to the performance of Africa's cities in the context of lacking planning and policy attention. So this brings me to the next sections of the report, where we look more at policies, what can be done and what should be done. And there's where we looked at the importance of integrating cities and urbanization and national development planning, but also the importance of local economic development planning and policies. So again, cities have been absent, largely absent in the debates. And this leads to a lack or disconnection between national plans and the territorial and spatial realities of countries. So you don't have the adequate infrastructure to connect, for instance, cities. You have a regulatory environment which is not supportive of cities and local governments, and leading to lack of coordination as well across different policy domains, which is important. So this leads to very high costs of doing business in African cities, also leads to high costs of living. And we know that African cities are very expensive compared to other places in the world at comparable levels of income. So there is really something in African cities that drives costs up, which then obviously reduces possibilities of investment for households and improvements in living standards. So all these then also lead to a lost productivity, competitiveness, and employment. So what we think is important going forward is that national governments refocus also in the development planning on the importance of cities and urbanization. This across the whole urban network. So we think location and sector targeting is important. So countries should prioritize investment in areas and key sectors for job creation and structural transformation, because this is where cities drive the development process. Investments in city productivity are important. So this is investments in infrastructure and services typically, and they should serve firms and workers. So it's not just on looking at the business side, but also at the worker side, the household side, how you can access opportunities, how you can reduce transaction costs and search costs, for instance. Also, the urban network. Often the narrative on Africa's cities is focused on the big cities. They do absorb quite a large share of the total population, but we have seen what I've shown on the proximity of rural households to small urban areas, and also the good performance of small urban areas compared to rural areas. There's a need to also look at the entire urban network. What is the role of small and intermediary cities, and also connect this network to leverage again broader opportunities across the territory regions. And something that is really important is the policy coordination and planning. And this is horizontally and vertically, because often we have sectoral policies in place, but they do lack a coordination across different levels of government, and they're not well planned. This is something that we believe is also due to a lack in data and understanding of the transformations going on. So this also necessitates more investments into the data, better understanding the specificities of regions and cities, where the potentials, where the constraints, and then develop better plans. Beyond the national side, there's the local side, which is crucially important. And we have seen, for instance, China is a good example for the role of local government in driving local economic development policies. So local governments are essential in this place. They are the closest to the context, and they have information advantages compared with national governments. So, and this is because cities are very different in terms of their specialization, in terms of their endowments, skilled workforces, natural resource endowments, but also in their role in the national urban system. We have spatial differences, distance to ports, distance to borders, distance to closer to bigger cities. All these impact also the economic potential. They have to be integrated. There are different geographic scales, and therefore administrative scales for designing and implementing policies. And this is where local government is well placed to serve this purpose. And again, it's also something, the importance of, it's a horizontal coordination, it's collaboration across different domains. So it's the private sectors, but it's also the civil society sectors. It's the universities to define common plans and strategies to see where the bottlenecks, where is the potential to invest. However, this is the theoretical construct where local government are important, but the current context in Africa is that many countries, although having made progress in decentralization, it's still lacking. It's still lacking, especially in terms of the fiscal decentralization. In many cases, we have administrative decentralization, but the fiscal decentralization hasn't followed suit. And something that is also impeding the situation is the fragmentation of local government, local administrative boundaries. Every country defines administrative boundaries that are then used to implement policies and define programs. In the context of Africa, where you have this fast urban growth, these boundaries are set to become obsolete over time. And there's the example of Greater Accra. You see the municipalities, you see Greater Accra, and you see the built-up area. And there's obviously a need to update and adjust these administrative boundaries to reduce this fragmentation, because we have seen, or the OECD has done analysis for OECD countries and showed that the more administrative layers you have, the less efficient policy implementation and coordination becomes logically. So there is a need to empower local governments to be a stronger actor in development policy and development economics. So increasing decentralization. The table, you don't need to see the countries that are there, but this is a listing of the institutional environment in terms of how favorable it is for local government. Green is favorable and red is very unfavorable. And in between is somewhat favorable and not very favorable. Although there's improvement, but you see there's still more than half of the countries in Africa where the decentralization framework is really not supportive of local governments. So again, we need to develop coherent legal institutional frameworks, and there's also the need to develop then the fiscal and administrative capacities of local governments, because this also often is a constraint for better policies. Again, not again, but something also which I haven't mentioned before. You need the national policies, but you also need the local policies, and you have to see the complementarity between them, these two. And this demands a coordination across different levels. So these are principles. They are not a blueprint, because as I said before, they are very different contexts of cities. But on average, these are some of the aspects that are important for good local economic development plans. So you need strategic planning and coordinated policy packages. They have to be consistent over time and adapted to the local capacities. Strategic planning is a process whereby the local government with different domains and partners invests in discovering where the potential is. And here something that is important is to stimulate or to look at activities where you already have an advantage that you can easily implement. Because these plans have to be matched to the capacity you have in terms of endowments, but also in terms of your fiscal and administrative capacity. Many plans in Africa are not being implemented because there's this lag between the plan and the reality of what you're able to do. So again, look at what you can do in the local context and stimulate these activities initially. So this is about the right economics specializations and the right scale for productivity increases. Something that has been shown very important across the globe is the engagement with universities and the private sectors to develop coherent policy packages for local economic development. And this brings me to the last section of the presentation, is the crucial importance of financing this urban expansion, this urbanization. And this first slide is reflecting the reality. It shows the investment of local government per capita in Africa and in other regions of the world. This is in PPP terms, so it's not only low because African countries are poor, but it's low because it is indeed very low. And again, this is in the context of this rapid urban growth and the lack of infrastructure. So it's even worse than what it's shown on the figure. And this is also because local governments in Africa have exceptionally low budgets and generate very low own revenues to then invest in its areas. So only 60% or 16% of total revenue is local government revenue versus a world average of 26% and 64% in North America. So this incomplete fiscal decentralization is obviously a break for local governments to pursue effective policies. So, and this is not only the problem of low revenues, but it's also limited transfers from national governments. The government transfers, which you have in every country, are limited, and they are also highly conditional. So in many cases, national governments are going to transfer money to the local governments, but it's more for service delivery than for actually developing their own policies and their own programs, and often also with high unpredictability. This then leads to investments that are not maintained, that are not consistent over time. As I said before, it's important that they be consistent over time. So the problems are not just the money, it's also then again the conditionality, how much freedom you have to invest in what you want and how predictable these funds are. And local governments also have very restricted access to financial markets. Local government borrowing is an important source of financing in other areas of the world. And this also going forward, because urbanization is going to continue for the next decades, investments are needed. So investing or seeing how local government can access financial markets is going to be crucial. So the different approaches that we think are needed to develop the capacity of local government is higher, more stable and more predictable transfers from national governments. Local governments should also invest in greater own resource revenue generation. So this is local taxes, for instance, this is fees for the use of certain services, and then also access to financial markets. This obviously requires that the legal and institutional environment is adequate for these processes. So we need regulation at the national level that allows local governments to access and mobilize own resources. Something at least as important is then also to improve the fiscal capacity of local governments. Many countries in Africa, the local capacity to manage these funds is also very limited. And there are sections in the report that show different data on this. So we need to invest in these capacities. Again, more resources are needed for that. But this is going to have also a reinforcing impact, because when you have a better management of local resources, this also increases your capacity to access financial markets, improves your use of financial resources, and can be beneficial over the long term. So beyond the national administrative level, investing in local capacity is crucial. I'm ending here, hoping for interesting comments and questions. The report is downloadable on the OECD website, as well as on the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa website and the African Development Bank's website. Thank you very much.